Good morning, everyone. How very nice to be with you again. We are working on our salient qualities of the Master, how to live like Yogananda, from Swami Kriyananda's biography. We're working from chapter 17. This is probably our last week on it. This is Monday, and every Monday I remind you that this ministry, which we call Mission of the Masters, the mission of the Masters is to bring a higher understanding onto this planet at this time to help take us into a higher age. And it's been my extraordinarily fortunate karma to have spent my adult life working with Swami Kriyananda and on his behalf to help carry this out. And we've reached the point of what we're doing where we need support from those who feel that this is an important work to do, something that you would like to put your resources into as well to enable me to share these teachings and to have the people that I need to help me do it. Some of you who watch regularly may notice that we've reoriented the camera and now you're looking at a bigger part of the living room where I've been speaking from for many years. I've mentioned the name Ishani to you. She's the one who's been coordinating all the outreach. Well, she and her husband Arivan live in India, but they're on sabbatical right now. Sabbatical isn't quite the right word because that implies they're not working, but they're in America and staying in this house and immediately started improving what we were doing. At least I think it's improvement. I hope you like it. So again, if any of you feel that this work is something that you want to put your heart into also, money is what we need to pay the staff, to support me personally, to support as soon as I'm able more touring and traveling. Also, the Italian translation of my book about Swamiji, Light Bearer, is almost done. And there's going to be printing costs on that book soon. And the Spanish translation of that book is also close to completion. We don't have specific plans yet about whether that will be more than an e-book, but because of your generosity, we can have a serious conversation now about whether we can also put that into print for those who would like that book, and that's all because of what you've given. You can support through Patreon, which is a subscription service, a marvelous, innovative idea to connect supporters and creative people to do the kind of work that others may think is worth supporting. You can go to Patreon, or you can go to my website, Asha Joy, and we have a way for you to go through PayPal and through other means. So, very, very grateful. Now, let's start with the prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your presence, to know that everything we do is an expression of your divine will. Lift our understanding beyond the obvious attractions of the limited world in which we live, that we may see the divine hand operating through everything, sorrowful or joyful, understandable or confusing. Help us to feel that there is a divine pattern carrying us to our one true home in spirit. Om. Peace. Amen. The characteristic for today is really quite interesting. It's one of the more interesting stories here. You know, we get this, what happens after a master dies is fact begins to become legend. It was a very interesting comment from a biographer of Sri Ramakrishna, who actually deliberately wrote, not a factual biography, but he wrote the legends surrounding the life of Sri Ramakrishna. And he wrote how he felt that legend was actually a truer representation of a master than just ordinary factual biography, because ordinary words and experiences do not convey the extraordinarily different consciousness that a master actually has. So the myths and legends are created to help the human mind grasp even a little bit of what the reality of that master really was. It was a very interesting theory to me. I don't really know if I believe it or not, but it was an interesting way to think about it. So what happens is that we tend to sort of, out of a desire not to dwell on the negative, for example, we just begin to whitewash what happens, and gradually the great saint, the great master, drives onto the field of history, or rides onto the field of history in his beautiful white horse and gallops through the pages of his life, and then fades off into the sunset. And the distance between the practical experience that he had and the practical experience that we have begins to widen. And on one level, as I was saying, in quoting that other author, there is a certain truth in it. But on the other hand, it does the master's mission a great disservice, because when we ourselves are assaulted by the shadows of this world, we imagine sometimes that there's something wrong with us, rather than realizing this is just what happens when there's a great deal of light. So Master himself faced a lot of very challenging and difficult situations. The one I'm about to read is not this, but when he went to Miami, Florida to speak, for example, Master was dark-skinned. And at that time, there weren't that many people from Asia, India, China, wherever. There weren't that many living in the U.S. There were more Chinese, but they had been brought in first as laborers, so there was a lot of prejudice in that direction. But Master was simply dark-skinned, and he went to the South. He went to Miami. And they treated him as a Negro and felt that he was bound by the segregation laws that were still in place. And he tried to explain that, he was of the Caucasian race, if they were going to think like that. He wasn't white, but he was Caucasian, insofar as those racial definitions mean anything at all, which they were totally fabricated. They don't really mean anything. And he refused to cooperate. I don't know if it was in Florida, or it might have been on a train. He was in a restaurant somewhere, and the waiter refused to serve him because he was dark-skinned. And somehow Master absolutely insisted on being served. And when the plate came, he threw it in the face of the waiter and walked out of the restaurant. So sometimes it's like, real action is required. Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple. Master was never able to make headway in Miami, and he finally just left town and literally wiped the dust of the city off his feet. And then he prayed to God that, that some corrective be issued. And it was either the police chief or the mayor who was arrested for murder soon after. Racially motivated murder. So I say that only, that's not what we're talking about, although the topic today is learn to behave. So throwing a plate of food into the face of someone who is unspeakably prejudiced and needs to be corrected is interesting. Master only did what Divine Mother told him. But here's what we're talking about today. Master always knew how to act appropriately. Today is Sri Yukteswar's birthday, and one of his maxims was, learn to behave. In other words, you have to relate to this world as well as the world beyond. So he always knew, apparently, Master learned the lesson of his guru. Master always knew how to act appropriately. One time a newspaper sent two young women to interview him at a hotel. They wanted to enter his room, but he said, let's talk out here in the corridor. Both women wore provocatively low-cut blouses. The Master, throughout the interview, gazed fixedly into their eyes. As they left, they seemed disappointed. Yogananda went to the newspaper and asked the editor why he'd sent them, really. And the editor replied, if you'd invited them into your room, or allowed your gaze to shift down for even a second, the editor responded, I'd have plastered that story on the front page of my newspaper. Master exclaimed, that's a terrible thing to do. So in that way you ruin the reputation and maybe the lives of perfectly innocent people? I call that contemptible. A newspaper should report the news, not create it. And even if it does create it for editorial purposes, it should not be scurrilous. Well, there you have it. The lack of evidence did not stop the newspapers from trying to taint Master's reputation. Many of his disciples were women, and many of those disciples were young women. So immediately, as Swami put it, the reporters project upon the situation what they would do if it was their opportunity, and then they just assume that that's what Master was doing. And there were bad newspapers, newspaper stories printed about him, especially when one of his disciples betrayed him and tried to get money in the courts, and then it goes up in the newspaper. What's alleged in a lawsuit is exempt from the libel laws. So if someone who wants to destroy the reputation of a spiritual person puts something as an allegation into a lawsuit, even if there's no support for it, because in the American system it takes time to prove that. In some court systems there's a point at the very beginning where they decide whether there's enough merit to go forward, but that's not how the American system works. So you can file anything, which this disciple did file against Master, and alleged misbehavior of this kind, immoral behavior with women, and then it can be reported in the headlines of the newspaper, and all they have to say is, it has been alleged. But in America, where people read the newspapers and pay attention and have a certain expectation of integrity in those newspapers, just the accusation for a spiritual person is sufficient to destroy their reputation. Can be. Master, after this incident, and he wrote an article called The Yellow Journalism. I don't know where it was printed, maybe in SRF magazine, or maybe he sent it to some of those places. And he just spoke about the consciousness behind, the desire to pull down anything that looks good. Now it's become so commonplace, people don't even think of it as an alternative. Master, writing 100 years ago, saw this horrible trend of desire to believe the worst and to tear down people's faith. That's what's happening in our society now, that there's a deep, determined, I would say, satanically inspired effort to tear down people's faith. And so those of us who do not want to be part of a satanically inspired reality have to plant ourselves firmly on the side of light. There was a woman who was trying to get a PhD or a master's degree from Berkeley University. This would have been 30 years ago. And she took as her subject, she met Swami Kriyananda. She was an Indian woman. She met Swami, she met Ananda. She wrote about our community. That was her thesis. I think she was a journalism student, if I'm not wrong. She could not get her thesis accepted because it described Ananda in too positive a way. It was like it was rejected because the subject was presented in too positive a way. But I mean, that was the subject. But she never got her degree. She couldn't get it. She couldn't get her thesis accepted, and she couldn't go rewrite it to be something it wasn't. Now, there's two sides to this. I mean, Master, he always knew how to behave appropriately, which is, of course, I think it's kind of hard to outwit an omniscient Master, someone whose consciousness is everywhere. He knew what those women were doing. There was also a story in in England, not in England, but in India. When he was in India in 1935, the British, at that time, Indians were beginning to agitate for freedom, which Gandhi finally led, took the country of India away from the British domination. But when Master was there in 1935, in 1948 is when India became a free country. So the agitation was already beginning. And Master was, the typical example of the kind of person who was agitating. And he, of course, was very much for it, even though he never participated in that. He went to visit Gandhi. He put a chapter about Gandhi in his book. But at one point, they sent an attractive young woman to Master, and she was, the details of it are not quite clear to me at the moment, but she was in ways behaving in a provocative way, was trying to get Master, she was trying to kiss him, she was trying to get him to kiss her with reporters around. And Master knew exactly what was up, and exactly how he outfoxed him, I'm not sure, but at some point he took her by the waist and he lifted her up over his head, and then he turned to the reporters and said, "Take your picture now," But they wouldn't do it. But there are these women too, who just felt that somehow they were serving some good cause by, Satguru has a marvelous phrase about women who are deliberately provocative, and in the physical way. He said he calls it leading with your biology. When some young people asked Master, what he thought about the way women dress or whether it was appropriate, and he said, he was talking to a woman, and he said, well, it's really up to you. He said, you have many characteristics. He said, and one of them is your biology. And if you wish to, as he put it, lead with your biology, which is dress in such a way that the first emphasis is on the fact that you have a female body, and you would like the first thing that people to know about you is, I am a female and I have a female body. Lead with your biology, he said. That's what you want. It's a very effective way to do it. I've loved that. It was such a perfectly clear, but neutral, in the sense that it's your call. Who do you think you are first? How do you want to be perceived first? Make up your mind. So when these women lead with their biology and the effort to draw a male person into a response to that biology, and then to smear that person for responding, well, this is an odd world, isn't it? And Master was not at all afraid to just stand up to that. He didn't have he wasn't squeamish, he wasn't prudish. He just, well, if this is what you're trying to do, this is my response to it. Now, the whole phrase, learn to behave, that Sri Yukteswar said to Master, it came also in a slightly different context, not as an extreme context as this. Master said that when Master's talking years in my Master's hermitage, an autobiography of a yogi, he says that his guru seldom said anything to him about his spiritual dedication, about his meditation efforts, about his devotion to God. Well, he was an avatar. But Master said, somewhere along the way, I picked up the convenient idea that because I was interested in the spiritual, I could be essentially very sloppy and inattentive to any other aspect of life. There's the story, an autobiography of a yogi, of Master's carelessness in not locking the ashram gate, and as a consequence, he'd brought these cauliflowers as a gift for his guru, and he had 5 or 6 of them, and Sri Yukteswar inspired some sort of slightly foolish man to sneak in through the unlocked gate and go right to where the cauliflowers were hidden and take one of the cauliflowers. As Master said, ignoring his gold watch and other jewelry that was there, he had a cauliflower obsession. It's a very humorous story, an autobiography of a yogi. But that kind of carelessness about proper behavior, Sri Yukteswar would not tolerate it. As he said, spirituality is not dumbness. And so that is something that a lot of us have had to learn on the spiritual path, which is how to behave appropriately, how to be gracious, how to respond to individuals according to who they are and what would communicate with them, instead of just sort of aloofly following our own trajectory without regard for the consequences. One can be divinely inspired to do that, but one should not presume that one has a divine mandate to behave that way. And it's relevant that even Master had to be trained by Sri Yukteswar in how properly to be in this world. And of course, Swami Kriyananda was always appropriate. He, I mean, it's a small thing, but not really. He always dressed very graciously. He never appeared in a sloppy way. Swami said when he was a young monk, you know, he thought part of his detachment was he had torn clothes and so on like that, and Master chastised him. Rajasi was coming to visit, and Master thought it was important that they show respect for Rajasi, and he had the boys go and change their clothes. Swamiji was of a different generation, and he sort of missed the wave where denim became quite acceptable wear. He always called any kind of jeans, anything made out of denim, he called them dungarees. And he thought they were suitable for farm work, but not suitable for everyday behavior. And he refused to accept the trend that they were okay. So many of us just never wore jeans, even if we wore them at other times of our lives. We never wore them around Swami, because to his eye, it didn't look appropriate. And even when we had a big program once and he'd invited some wonderful devotees to speak at that program, one of them was this very well-known artist named Joan Brown. She died, unfortunately, young in an accident in India, not at Ananda's ashram, but at another ashram. But when she appeared in a beautiful pair of slacks. And afterwards, Swami was slightly uneasy. Was it all right? You know, that I was surprised to see Joan, he said, wearing trousers, you know, on such an event. We had to explain to him that it was perfectly fine. But many of us, including me, I didn't wear jeans and I didn't wear slacks when I was with Swami, because by his standards it wasn't appropriate. And so I always keep that in mind. By whose standards, what is really appropriate? And why would I not? I mean, sometimes there's a principle at stake, that somebody's asking something of you that for some reason in principle is not appropriate. But at other times, why not? In autobiography, I seemingly am talking a lot about clothes, but clothes are an interesting indication of consciousness. In Autobiography of a Yogi, it talks about how there were 8 children in Master's family, and how his mother dressed them in clean clothes and an appropriate way to greet their father every day when he came home. Because their father went out and worked hard at the Nagpur Railway, where he was an executive, to make their life possible. And all of the children were benefiting from the selfless labors of their father. And their mother wanted them to understand that they needed to be respectful and appreciative of him. I mean, such formality in our time and place is completely unheard of. But I'm not sure it's positive, completely positive, I would say, that many of these gestures of courtesy and kindness are no longer remembered. This was Sri Yukteswar's dictum, learn to behave. And Swami uses this particular very dramatic and entertaining example of Master learning to behaving appropriately. But the statement that Swami makes is unequivocal. Master was always appropriate in his behavior. And appropriate meant that he was gracious when graciousness was required, and he was absolutely adamant when that was what was appropriate. He would drive the money changers out of the temple if the money changers needed to be driven out, if that was appropriate. There are 8 manifestations of God, which I have actually talked about in other of these morning broadcasts. I'll just say them: love, peace, calmness, joy, power, light, sound, wisdom. 8 manifestations. None of them is the word nice. Which, it was a certain point in my own life experience where being nice somehow had become equated with spirituality. No, actually. All things being equal, one should be kind. That's a manifestation of love. And it's a manifestation of wisdom. So it's very appropriate. One should be kind if possible. But being nice is not always the right response. If there was a couple in our community that had been together they actually weren't in the community, they were neighbors, but they were close. And she had always been involved with Ananda, and he had not been. And after 7 years of their relationship, they separated. And when they separated, it came out that he had always profoundly opposed her involvement in the spiritual path. And whenever she would try to meditate, he would like turn on the television or the radio as loud as possible, just to keep her from being able to meditate. And she lived with him for 7 years. When Swami heard it, he was very calm, but he was very emphatic. I wouldn't have stood for that for 15 minutes. I mean, it was just like, it's not appropriate. And sometimes we just have to say, it's not appropriate. And sometimes we have to sacrifice ourselves to be kind. This is what someone wants of me. What difference does it make? Swami remarked about a very overbearing person that both of us had to work with. The person was very sincere, just overbearing. You know, having an overbearing personality does not disqualify you from being a wonderful devotee. It just makes personal interactions more complicated. But I was talking to Swami, and I was saying I was working with this person, and I was finding it a little tricky. He had a wonderful answer for me. He said, oh, when I'm with her, he said, I just don't bother to have a personality. He says, she has all the personality there's room for. But she was very sincere, and this was just an unfortunate characteristic of hers. But it wasn't about character, and it wasn't about devotion, so why not? So a lot of the time, to behave appropriately is to do what you can to help people. Why not? We don't always have to get our own way, and a lot of times the ways we want to get our own way are just completely meaningless. But when true principles are involved, soft as a flower where kindness is concerned, more adamant than granite stone where principles are at stake. I haven't quite quoted it exactly, but that's how Master described Sri Yukteswar, his own guru. When it was possible to be as kind as you can possibly be. Where true principles are at stake, just take your position and let nothing be unmoved. This is behaving appropriately. And every aspect of our life experience is an expression of the divine and an opportunity for us to be instruments of God. And in this way also, let us learn to live like Yogananda. God bless you.